he's going out doing podcasts now.
Okay.
But he's also extremely good on the market and talking about the market and price of gold. And he's been a gold hoarder his whole life. His father was a very successful neurosurgeon over in Trenton. So he inherited money, and he bought a lot of gold with it. And so he's always calling me. He's come out here and sit by the pool, call me and say, hey, I got a couple of Canadian maple leafs you want to buy. Whenever he needs money, he sells some gold. But now he's buying gold. So
Wait, so the stuff that he was selling originally was gold that he had or gold that he purchased and resold to you?
Well, he bought a bunch of it, I think, when he inherited money from his father. And he's been kind of living off that gold and silver. So he would sell me like gold coins at the spot price, which is a very good buy because he just wanted cash. Now gold is at record highs.
Has he written any other books?
No, he's written a lot of stuff, but not necessarily books.
Matt, have you started recording or no?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
I will. He called me up and told me about this deal. I'm buying these 1/10 of an ounce American gold coins, and I bought some of them, and he bought some of them, and they were. So he sent me another text today. I'll show you. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I'll show you some of his lengthy tests about gold, why you should buy it, and everything. So he's interesting in that regard, but he's also interesting in this really strange book that he wrote, but you'd find the guy interesting.
Well, I want to talk to you about a lot of things because, one, you're a plethora of knowledge.
A plethora means the true meaning of the word plethora is a useless abundance.
Oh, okay. So what's a useful abundance?
Now, what people use that word plethora wrong all the time. Like you could say there is a plethora of federal regulations.
Okay.
A useless abundance.
Plethora of Democrats. You can say.
And so plethora, it's really the true meaning of the word. People just think it means an abundance, but it's a useless abundance, unnecessary abundance.
Well, what's a useful abundance?
A wellspring.
Well, you're a wellspring of knowledge, and I think a lot of it's come just with time, but you read a lot of books.
I do read. I probably read a book a week at least.
Which means we're going to have to read a lot of books because, I want to know a lot of the topics that instead of just getting the information from you, I'd rather get the information as well from other sources. But one thing that I want to talk about is John Glover, and this is why. Because I think by today's standards, and maybe I just feel this way or others do, when I think of individuals in wartime today, I think of Navy SEALs and I think of Rangers and I think of these really cool badasses that we see. And when I think of the Revolutionary War, and I think others do too, we just see this formation fighting where one side shoots, the other side shoots, and I just don't know many of the badasses from the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. Like, you don't hear about the spies that often, which there were spies during the Revolutionary time. You can go back to, the Greeks and the Romans, and there was Achilles and all those badass individuals that we know about, but I don't hear often of the badasses of the American Revolution.
Well, that is a question that's right in my wheelhouse there, because the badasses of a good example of the badasses of the American Revolution were Glover's Marblehead Mariners, his Marblehead Regiment. I have often, if I ever really had the time, which I don't, I've thought about writing a book on there were maybe 8 or 10 leaders in the American Revolution who were fiercely loyal to Washington, would run through a wall for Washington, and always, the good thing about them was they always came out the other side. They did absolutely crazy things. One of them from Wayne, he was from
Mad Anthony Wayne.
Mad Anthony Wayne led a regiment. He did some incredible things. He went down and stole like 100 head in their Valley Forge, 100 head of cattle from the British, drove the cattle up through New Jersey, put them on a ferry in Philadelphia under the nose of the British, got them across up to Valley Forge, and they had steak for dinner that night in Valley Forge. He did things like that constantly throughout the American Revolution. He was a badass. If there were Navy SEALs back then, he would have been a Navy SEAL commander.
How do you steal 100 cattle and get away with it?
I don't know. I'll find you those citations in the books on the American Revolution about Mad Anthony Wayne. And he was also a bit of a scalawag. He was a ladies' man. He was now Valley Forge is a big picture of Anthony Wayne. He was a very nice looking guy. He was a dapper guy. And one day at Valley Forge, he walked into Valley Forge with the wife of the leading, the highest ranking enlisted guy in the British Army. Had this beautiful wife in Philadelphia. And Van Anthony Wayne went into Philadelphia, picked her up, and took her up to Valley Forge on his arm. He was that kind of a goofball.
That's a slap in the face.
To the British.
Yeah.
And John Glover, I'm putting, there are others like that. John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones has this rickety old ship called the Bonhomme Richard, named after Benjamin Franklin's book, Poor Richard's Almanac. And it's an old merchant ship that's been turned into, and he faces the British Serapis, which is one of their proudest ships of the line, which you had to have 64 guns to be considered a ship of the line. And they get real close together. He throws grappling hooks over. He has his Marines shooting the British. The ship is vastly superior. And he's the one who said, I have just begun to fight. One of his men says to now the British can hear each other shouting. One of his men says to John Paul Jones, "We're going to lose. We're losing. We have got to give up. We've got to surrender to the British." And the British commander says, "Do I hear you, sir? You intend to surrender?" And John Paul Jones says, "I have just begun to fight." Takes out his pistol and he shoots the guy who said we should surrender. Jumps down, takes that guy's cannon, spins it around, and shoots it at the base of the main mast of the British Serapis. And the main mast comes down. The British get completely disoriented by this. John Paul Jones guys jump on and they capture the British man of war.
See, that's the stories that we don't hear about of the Revolution.
No, it's the sizzle. It's what I call the sizzle. Then he sailed it into a Dutch port and got it fixed, and then it became part of the American Navy. So, yeah, there were guys like that, and there was probably 8 or 10 of them. And one of them was John Glover from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Originally from Salem, he became a merchant in Marblehead.
Just a town up, right?
Correct. Salem is just 4 or 5 miles from Marblehead, and but that's where he was born, and then he settled in Marblehead. But the stories, some of the things that he did during the American Revolution, I mean, the 3 times he saved Washington's army. In New York, he rode 900 men, horses, cannon, and baggage across the lower East River, which is a mile. The distance is a mile, and I've rode that when we were up there to reenact the Battle of Brooklyn. Rode them across the East River in the middle of the night under the cover of darkness and under a dense fog. Saved Washington's army after the disastrous Long Island campaign. And then he saved them at Pell's Point, and then he got Washington's army across the river down here.
Now, first, I've always envisioned when Glover started in Massachusetts, first, how did he get the call to start working with Washington? And did his men sail from Massachusetts over to Connecticut, or did they walk?
No, they walked.
300
They
miles.
walked from Marblehead to Cambridge, which was where the Continental Army was, holding the British in Boston. And then after the British evacuated Boston in St. Patrick's Day in 1776, March 17th, then Washington knew they were coming back, and we'll get into that in more detail. And that's when Washington marched down to defend New York, because that's where he thought the British were coming back, and they did. And so Glover's men, who had marched maybe 10 miles to Cambridge, served as Washington's lifeguard, his personal bodyguard. By the way, they were living in this big, beautiful mansion, and when Washington got to Cambridge in 1975, he said, "I want that for my headquarters." And they went down and they took over a tavern. And that's where the Marbleheaders moved into, and they lived in the upstairs of this fancy tavern in Cambridge.
How many Marbleheaders?
Originally, there were 500.
Oh, my God, that's a lot.
The original regiment in Marblehead included 5 companies. 10 companies of 50 men. It was really like 550, counting the music, because they all had fifers and drummers and physicians and barbers and things like that went with them. About 550, about 500 fighting men in the original Marblehead Regiment, which was formed right after Bunker Hill in June of 1775. Now, we'll talk about why you're asking me, why would Colonel Glover, how did he get to be what happened? What events led up to him?
Yeah, were there other sailors that they could have asked? I mean,
Okay, after the Boston Tea Party, which was in December of 1771, the Boston Tea Party absolutely infuriated the British. We threw the equivalent of $2 million worth, we mean the American colonists. I wasn't one of them. The American colonists, disguised as Indians, threw about $2 million worth of British tea into Boston Harbor. And the British never forgave that. At the end of when the American Revolution ended, the British still wanted compensation for that tea that was thrown in the harbor. And part of the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution in 1783, part of the deal was the British had some forts up along the Great Lakes that they had to close. And the Americans had to pay Britain back for the tea. The Americans never paid Britain back for the tea, so the Brits never abandoned those little small forts they had up on the Great Lakes. But that's how significant it was to the British that over 10 years later, they were still crying about it.
$2 million in that time, which would be $40 million today.
Yeah,
something like
it's
that.
a lot, a whole very, very valuable cargo. Well, that happened in 71, and the British implemented it. It really infuriated them. So they implemented what came to be called, in American history books, it's called the Intolerable Acts. And then there are other names, the British had other names for it. So one of the first things they did was they forbade fishing on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. So part of Glover's fleets, Glover was a ship owner. He owned many ships, some fishing ships and merchant vessels. So that it rendered all of the fishermen of Marblehead unemployed, because that's where they fish. They fish the codfish shoals up off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, which it's not that far. It also forbade the Americans could only could only trade directly with Britain. They had been trading extensively with the Caribbean, with Spain, the Canary Islands, and so on. And the Intolerable Acts forbid them to transship anywhere else except with Britain. So it cut way down on their trade. And one of the last things that the Intolerable Acts did was they closed the port of Boston. So basically, Marblehead is only about 9 miles north of Boston. So if you were a young man of fighting age in 1774, early 1775, you were unemployed. And so Glover had been involved in what was called then the Committees of Correspondence, which was kind of the underground group that was fomenting the American Revolution. They corresponded with other states, and they held secret meetings. They actually manufactured some weapons, and they were the ones that were really spawning the American Revolution behind the scenes. Glover now is a very successful merchant vessel owner and fishing boat owner, and now he's out of business.
Can you pull up the Intolerable Acts?
Yeah, and there's actually several components to it. So Glover, they see the Boston Port Act and so on and so forth. So the
Stamp Act was part of the Intolerable Act?
No, the Stamp Act was a holdover from the French and Indian War. The Stamp Act infuriated the people of Boston.
So it sounds like they're just brewing up enough.
Well, the point I'm getting to, that's why John Glover, and in June of 1775, John Glover was tasked with creating a state militia regiment.
Okay.
And he recruited 550 people, and it was basically all the men of fighting age in Marblehead joined this regiment because they were unemployed and they were very, very angry. And so whatever gripes the rest of the colonies had with England, primarily the Stamp Act, and there were other things that are not well known that were going on, but The people in Massachusetts and around Boston were now put out of work.
Well, everyone knows about the taxes, right? Was this part of it? Like the no taxation without representation type?
Right, and that was well, there were a lot of taxes. And I'm going to step back a little. In the French and Indian War, sometimes called the First World War because it was fought all over the world. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War, but we here call it the French and Indian War. It was fought between England and France primarily, although Spain got involved a little bit. But when the French and the British were very successful in the French and Indian War. When the French and Indian War ended, that's when the expression "the sun never sets on the British Empire," that's when that came into being. Because when it ended, Britain had taken Canada from the French. They took the Philippines. They had India. They had the Rock of Gibraltar. They had Gibraltar and the entrance to the Mediterranean. So, and they had properties now all over the world, so that the sun never set on the British Empire. However, the French and Indian War nearly bankrupted the court of England, and it bankrupted the court of France as well, because it was a very expensive war fought all over the world. There was King George III became king of England. I think it was 1763, right as the French and Indian War ended. George III became king when his grandfather, George II, died, George I. His father was supposed to be George II, but his father had died right before that, and so he became king as a teenager, like 17, 18 years old. It was customary for a new king to re-sign all the old laws. So there were tariffs and taxes that weren't being enforced, and he re-signed them. But one of the main reasons he did that was because the court of George III had been nearly bankrupted by the French and Indian War, and the English, the crown, thought that the Americans should help pay for it because the English had essentially saved them from the French-inspired Indian tax and had made North America a safe place for them.
Well, didn't we fight on the side of the British during the French and Indian War?
Did.
Wasn't Washington part of that?
Washington started the French and Indian War.
What do you mean?
Washington was sent out. We're kind of jumping around, but the Washington in 1755, I believe, he was a captain in the Virginia militia, and he was sent out to what is the area around modern-day Pittsburgh. Very interesting. Pittsburgh, you have the confluence of three rivers: the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela. So it was a very strategic place. The French trappers would come all the way down. You could come all the way down to Pittsburgh and go all the way down to New Orleans by using this river system. So it was a very, very strategic point. The French had laid claim to it. Also, the state of Connecticut, their charter said that their northern border followed a line of longitude that ran all the way to the next ocean, which was the Pacific. So the American colonies, the state of Connecticut laid claim to it. Virginia laid claim to this area. So it was contested. Washington, well, the colonists, the British Army here in North America at the time, got word that a small French brigade was coming down into that area to build a fort it would have been called Fort Duquesne, which is where Duquesne University is in Pittsburgh today. And Washington was sent out with a small troop, 20, 30 men, to intercept them and prevent them from building a fort. Well, when he got there, he had some Indian scouts who were really ruthless, but Washington could talk to the Indians, was good with them. They met this French unit. The French unit sent a note to Washington and said they wanted to have a powwow. They wanted to talk. And instead, the Indians attacked the French, which meant Washington ensued. There was a big fight. The Indians scalped several of the French. And the leader of that French unit was his brother was a leading French military leader up in Canada. That's infuriated the French. They came down and they attacked Washington. that anyway, that started the French and Indian War.
Okay, just for time reference, how long does it take for them to find out that the brother was attacked?
Weeks,
Weeks. That's not that long in that time.
but they did it. They
And then they find out where Washington is or where he's going, and then they have to track
Washington
him.
set up a what was called Fort Necessity. Set up a camp there. It was really a makeshift camp. It wasn't very good, and the French came down and attacked it, and they captured Washington, and they forced him to sign basically a confession for murdering this guy's brother. Very interesting. That was Washington was a 25-year-old captain, maybe 24. He was young.
So how old was he so 20 years later he's 44 and the revolution started?
When Washington crossed the Delaware at Trenton, he was 44 years old. So when it started, he was 43.
Did he fight anywhere in between the French and Indian and the American Revolution?
Absolutely. He went back out with Braddock. Then during the French and Indian War, General Braddock, who was the British commander in North America, took an expedition, marched through the woods of Pittsburgh. There was no roads, the woods of Pennsylvania, out to Pittsburgh to fight the French force that was now out there at Fort Duquesne.
For the king?
1750s.
Is he doing this for the king now?
Braddock is doing it for the king, and Washington is one of his aide-de-camp, but Washington's not a British officer. He's an officer in the Virginia militia, which the British treated with great disrespect. They just didn't think that the colonial officers were any good, but they took them when they needed them. They took soldiers when they needed them, but they didn't treat them very well. A lieutenant in the British Army outranked a captain in the American Army, so to speak. So there was a lot of things like that.
I feel like we still kind of do that today. Right, if we go over and fight in another country, I mean, if we're training somebody in the Middle East, one of their countries, I mean, we would rank higher than.
I don't think we would formally have a program like that, like the British did, though.
But I feel like if you're fighting on our side, we're going to respect the individual who's on our side more than we're going to respect the I don't know, whatever country we're in, the Iranian military forces.
Well, a couple of years later, Braddock goes back to fight the French now the French Indian War had started. And Braddock's going back to attack the French at Fort Duquesne. And the French had Indian allies. The Indians liked the French because the French didn't put up fences and take land, and the French took Indian wives. When French trappers would have a wife at every major Indian settlement down the Mississippi River, they would take a wife in the Indian and keep on going to the next place and take a wife. And the Indians got along a lot better with the French than they did the British. The British put up fences and said, "This is my land," and the Indians didn't understand that, the concept of owning land. The land was everybody's. Well, anyway, Braddock goes out there. The French soldiers, under the guidance of they have a significant Indian troop there, Indian tribe now that's fighting with them. They disguise themselves, they dress up as Indians, and they, along with the Indians, they use Indian tactics. They attack Braddock, and they decimate Braddock's army. Braddock is shot off his horse. Washington has 2 horses shot out from underneath him. His coat, from flailing out in the wind, has bullet holes in it.
Oh, I thought that was during the Revolution.
This is during the French and Indian War. Washington picks up Braddock and carries him to put him on a stretcher, and now takes over command of Braddock's forces and leads them out of the ambush. But something, I'm not sure exactly, 75% of the Brits are killed, and so they lose the battle and they march back, and Braddock is killed, the British commander, and Washington gets great accolades for.
Oh, he doesn't get blamed for it.
For how well he performed, and that was some of his early training as a general. But we were, Well,
real quick before we jump off of this. So the scene in The Patriot when Mel Gibson is talking about the French and Indian Wars, I think it's the very beginning of the movie, and one of his sons asks him about the one scene or the one battle, and he's like, "I will never speak about that." And that's when the French, he says how he attacked a fort and it was a slaughter and they killed everybody there.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, the British Duquesne, we wasn't talking about Duquesne because it's the British who got slaughtered. And Mel Gibson would have fought on the side of the British. So I'm not sure I'm not sure there's a specific battle that he's referring to, just the brutality of the French and Indian War.
Yeah, because then the scene happens where he kills all the British and he's hiding in the woods and his sons are there shooting as well.
And
And
he
then
throws the axe.
yes, and he revisits it, and then it's something to do with him speaking about that, and then the brutality of how he was able to go to a brutal place during that scene.
That's where he learned to throw the hatchet like an Indian, too.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're jumping around, but John Glover. All right. So he
So the way we got into this, the British said, well, we fought that war to help the Americans. The Americans said, no, you fought that war. We made you the greatest power on the planet, and we helped you do it. Why are you making us pay for the war? So the British implemented a series of taxes after the French and Indian War, and there were violent protests in the colonies over them, and there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. And eventually, the British canceled all of their a lot of these taxes, like the molasses tax and so on. But they kept the Stamp Act in place, which was every newspaper, every letter, everything had to have a stamp on it, and you paid like a half a penny for the stamp, but it was still a lot of money to the people then. So
was it once free?
I'm so sorry.
Were stamps once free, or is it just there's a tax on top of it?
A stamp was like an ink stamp, like a little
Yeah.
rubber stamp kind of a thing. You had to get a stamp on just about anything that was printed. If you wanted to send out invitations to your daughter's wedding, you had to get a stamp on that printed material and pay a pittance, but you still had to pay. And that's where the colonists said, you don't have a right to tax us because we don't have representation in Parliament. And by the way, one thing about Americans had incubated this concept of representative government for 100 years because they were governing themselves by state legislature. You had a state legislature, which was elected from the people, and you had a king appointed a governor, a royal governor, who really did rule, but the royal governors were appointed from locals, and they were sympathetic to the local population. So unlike the rest of the world,
sympathetic or in fear?
Well, they were in fear of the king, but they still liked the local people.
But I feel like the local people tarred and feathered tax collectors.
Or they did in the Hutchison. He was the royal governor of Boston right before the Revolution. They burned his house down and tried to tar and feather him.
Have you that scene from the John Adams show? Mm-hmm. It's brutal, where they tar and feather him, then they put him on a pole and they walk him through the crowd. I think.
But I don't think they did that to the royal governor. They did it to some people, that feeling got worse and worse as it went closer to the American Revolution. But it's important to understand that the American population. And now as we turn into the 1770s, they were used to self-government. They weren't used to being told everything they had to do or could or can't do by the king, which is like the rest of the world was that way. That's why they called the king a tyrant. They just weren't used to that kind of tyranny. And this whole concept of self-governance had incubated in America for 100 years since the colonies were formed. So at any rate, that's the. The colonists said their position was, we have no representation in Parliament. You have no right to tax us because we don't do anything over here without representation. Parliament probably could have given them a couple of
seats.
In the House of Commons, but they didn't. So even though the Stamp Act wasn't particularly expensive, it did infuriate the Americans. The Stamp Act was still around. And then Britain imposed, what Britain said was they had imposed a tax on tea, and the Americans stopped drinking tea. That's why Americans became such big coffee drinkers. But they also...
Is that true? Is that when coffee started being imported?
I'm being glib. But Americans started drinking coffee instead of tea then. And then the British said, well, we'll take the tax off it, but you have to buy tea from the British East India Tea Company. And they said, we want to buy tea from anybody we want to buy it from. We don't want to have to be told who we can and can't buy tea from. And that was the ship that was in Boston Harbor when the colonists dressed as Indians, the Sons of Liberty under Sam Adams, John Adams' cousin, attacked the ship and threw all the tea overboard.
Now, did the British think that they could just keep implementing these stripes onto the colonists at the time and nothing was going to happen?
There were different schools of thought in England. The king felt like the colonies were being insubordinate and disrespectful. And at one point, at the early days of the American Revolution, he says, I don't want to really hurt them too bad. I just want to bloody their nose a little bit to bring them around. And then you had Lord North, who was the Minister for North America, who was somewhat virulent, pro-monarch, and, when the king tells you to do something, you do it. And so he was very much in favor of fighting and the putting down what he called, this revolution in the American colonies. But at the time, the British had the most powerful army in the world.
Yeah,
Nobody was second. And the thought that the American colonists could defeat the British Army was just absolutely unheard of in the minds of the British.
It sounds like they were spread pretty thin, though, if they're in all parts of the world right now. How large is their army that they're able to just push people out everywhere?
Excellent question, and I'm surprised I know the answer to that. When the American Revolution began in 1775, there were 55,000 in the British Army. Okay,
All over the world?
All over the world, 55,000. There was 15,000 in Ireland. There was some in Gibraltar, India, the Philippines. There was about 10 or 15,000 in England itself, and the rest, 20,000, were in the colonies. So they did not have.
That doesn't sound like much.
By modern standards, they did not have a very big. During World War II, we had 7 million men under arms.
Well, so the British were so powerful because of their navy.
Yes, the Navy is one of the things that it enabled the British to extend their reach of power, and Britain at the time had the most powerful Navy in the world. Now, France and Spain had pretty powerful navies as well, but the British were the 800-pound gorilla.
I guess they're not just to fight, but to stop trade routes, things like that.
To control trade around the world. There was something back then called mercantilism, and that's when you can Google over there. Mercantilism. British controlled trade. They controlled who you could trade with, how much you paid in trade, and there was a lot of. That was another underlying cause. It's one of the things that annoyed Washington, because Washington could only sell his goods in England through jobbers, people who brokered the sale of goods, and he had to pay commissions to them, and that always annoyed Washington. So there were a lot of other subtleties that annoyed people in the government regulation of a nation's economy for the purpose of augmenting state power at the expense of rival national powers.
Now, did they set up these trade routes that they believed that they had so much power over them?
That Britain protected the trade routes for sure, because there were pirates and there were renegade countries and all that.
We can go into pirates, but what's the difference between a pirate and a privateer? Because if you're saying
well, that's a whole separate subject. A privateer has a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E. It's a letter from his government that gives him the authority to interdict enemy shipping. Well, that was all fine and dandy until the problem is the British government did not recognize the American government, the American Continental Congress.
So we were all pirates?
So, as far as Britain was concerned, the privateers were all pirates.
So was Glover a pirate?
Glover came back. Glover was absolutely, he himself wasn't, but he created the first privateer ship called the Hannah, which is named after his wife. The Hannah is in the Naval Museum down at Annapolis as the Navy's first ship, the very first ship in the U.S. Navy. Now, there's a model of the Hannah. Glover was a merchant seaman. He basically had merchant ships. In October of 75, now this is after Bunker Hill, as we get into, Washington now is up in Cambridge, and Glover's men form his lifeguard. And in October of that year, Washington asked Glover to arm one of his merchant ships for the purpose of interdicting British shipping. And the Hannah goes out and does it, and I forget the name of the other ship that went out, and they captured a British ordnance ship coming to, it had like 2,000 muskets on it, tens of thousands of musket ball flints. It had a 14-inch mortar, and it had mortar shells and barrels of gunpowder.
No, when you say he captured it, he didn't just go out there and get them to surrender. He had to go That he had to
He
fight a
attacked
ship.
the ship. Well, what happened was the ship was a little slower than it was in a convoy, and it was the little. If you Google I'm not sure what Google here right now, but the British ship that Glover's men captured was in a convoy, but it had fallen behind the convoy, and it was amazing. They knew what was going on at sea. They had smaller clippers out there that were faster than the big transport ships, and they knew that this ship had fallen behind, and this one ship attacked it, and they would attack it. They would try to board it. They would come up close, throw like grappling hooks over, pull them close, jump over. That's why they used blunderbusses. They couldn't use a big long musket; could have got caught in the rigging. They used a blunderbuss, a short-barreled one to fight, and boarding axes, and they attacked the ship and they captured it and they sailed it. Actually, they sailed it up into Salem, I think. And
what did they do with those men? If they're not dead, do they keep them below deck and as prisoners?
Right. They wouldn't kill any more than they had to kill to capture the ship. And in this case, this was not a fighting ship. It was a transport ship. So there probably wasn't a lot of fighting. But they captured the ship and they provided the Continental Army with an incredible amount of ordnance and gunpowder and things that they just didn't have. They did two things. They provided the American Army with those munitions, and they deprived the British Army of those munitions.
So the British fought against their own munitions a lot during that war?
Well, yeah, the munitions that were on that ship, the muskets.
I mean, muskets were made we keep calling them Americans, but they weren't Americans at this point, right? So they were made in the colony. Oh, no, we keep saying, the Bluecoats at this time you keep calling Americans, but America wasn't called America yet, right?
Well, Amerigo Vespucci who it's named after was around. The Americas were called. It was called the Americas.
Oh, so the colonies at the time were called the Americas?
No, they would have been called. They were called the colonists or the Continentals. Sometimes they called them Continentals because they were forces authorized by the Continental Congress.
So what did the British call it when they would talk about the 13 colonies? What would they say? The colonies?
The colonies. And the Americans began, shortly after the Declaration of Independence, began calling the colonies the United States. They started using that term very early.
As a side note, Amerigo Vespucius, wasn't he's a cartographer or is he a sailor?
He was a mapper. He was a cartographer, and he was one of the first ones to map America, and he decided to name it after himself.
Yeah.
So, but that was early. I'm not sure the date, but as I say, early 1600s.
So how often were we sending out individuals to now capture more British ships if one was successful?
There were in many of Glover's Marbleheaders. Now, remember, the regiment is formed in June of 75, shortly after Bunker Hill. So Lexington and Concord is April. That started the war. The famous William Wadsworth Longfellow poem. It was the 18th of April in 75, and hardly a man is still alive who remembers that fateful day and year.
Shot heard around the world.
That was the shot heard around the world at Lexington Green, and then they had the Battle of Concord.
To this day, do we know who made that shot?
No. I mean, most historians, I think, believe Britt fired the first round, but nobody really knows for sure.
So we're sending out other.
So then in June of that year, we have Bunker Hill, and now the Continental Congress appoints Washington as the commander-in-chief of the forces, and he goes up to Massachusetts to take command of this very loosely organized ragtag army that is camped around Boston, and basically as the British trapped in Boston, and Washington begins a siege. But in October of that year, now he knows Glover because Glover's men are guarding him. Washington is developing great respect for Glover, which he will carry throughout the rest of the war. And he asked Glover to arm a couple of his merchant ships, and that's what Glover does.
Armed with like cannons and
put cannons on them.
Is that what arms mean?
Yes, armed. Arm them means get some smaller cannons because he couldn't put real big ones on them yet, but get some cannons, put them on your ship, and go out and attack British shipping. And that privateering would go on throughout the war, because, as I said, it's very dangerous.
Yeah, that's badasses that you don't hear about either.
Right.
Individuals that are just going to go out on a boat. I'm sorry, it's terrifying to think about. You go out, you're going to attack somebody out at sea. If you go down, you're out in the middle of the ocean.
Right. If you get, you don't want to be captured because you're considered a pirate. It's like a terrorist. You go to Guantanamo Bay.
Was there a Guantanamo Bay, the
No, there
colonies?
wasn't Guantanamo
Or would
Bay.
you go back to England? Or would you?
What they do worse than that, they would put you on a British warship and you would work down in the hold somewhere. So you would be the lowest guy on the ship, and it was an absolutely miserable existence if they didn't make you walk the plank or throw you overboard or something like that, wrap a couple of chains around you and throw you overboard.
These civilized people don't sound so civilized.
But if you were captured as a privateer, you were not having a good day. However, people, by the Battle of Trenton, many of Glover's men are original members of the regiment are out now privateering because the lore of privateering was interesting. If you captured a British ship with military stores on it, or whatever it would happen to be on it, brought it back into an American port, the captain got a percentage of the booty, a percentage of the take, and he had to split it with the rest of his crew. Now the executive officer would get the most, all the way down to the cook might get, but everybody on board the ship got a share of the spoils of that of that what they called a prize. If you captured a ship, it was called a prize.
Not treasure?
No, they would just call it a prize. And
Well, that sounds exciting.
And everybody got a share of the prize money. So guys went out to sea. Well, first of all, Gulliver's original regiment, they were primarily sailors. They weren't all sailors because there were people, just about everybody in the town joined the regiment. And the town was primarily made up of men of the sea, merchant seamen and fishermen and so on like that. But most of them were, but you had guys that made shoes, guys that made rope, guys that worked in the docks, but most of them were men of the sea, and they didn't like being foot soldiers. They didn't like being infantry. So when they had a chance to go back out to sea and be privateers, a lot of them took that opportunity because there was profit in it, but even though there was great danger.
And they weren't just going out there loosely looking for somebody. They would follow trade routes, I guess.
They would base their attacks on intelligence that they had gathered from other ships and however they would figure out, but sometimes they would just lay in wait on a route that the British would normally sail in, wait for them. Now, they're not attacking ships of the line, which are 64-gun ships. They're attacking like stragglers that are either unarmed or very...
like the FedEx of ships, like the FedEx...
Yeah, the FedEx ships, or very lightly armed. They might have a small 3-pound cannon or something.
Oh my God! So what if you go out there and you see one of those armed ships? You just turn your boat around and try to run away as fast as possible.
You ran, yeah.
Oh my, yeah. So what makes it? Okay, so I'm thinking of Pirates of the Caribbean. I know some of those ships in that movie. It's the Black Pearl's the quickest ship on the ocean or something. I don't know if that's true. If they say that. Other ones are not as quick. And then there was it starts with a C. I forget what it was. So some of those ships are going to be faster than others. Is it by the length of length of the sail?
Yeah, you had different levels. You had a ship of the line. You had frigates. A frigate was generally a smaller warship that was very fast because it was more narrow. The beam, the width across the ship on a man of war, a ship of the line, was huge. They were big, heavy ships, and they weren't.
Oh, like this, like aboard a man of war.
Yeah,
that's what they're talking about.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Those big ships weren't as fast as the smaller frigates, but the ships that were doing privateering were just a potpourri of whatever they had available. So some of them may have been fast, some of them weren't.
What's that movie with Russell Crowe?
Captains and Commanders.
Yeah.
That's a very good movie.
So they're going out there and they're fighting. Aren't they kind of doing something similar?
Two, a French ship of the line and a British ship of the line. He's on a ship of the line.
Aren't they tracking each other?
Yeah. It turns out the British ship's following him, but he tricks them into thinking he's a merchant ship by covering over the guns. Remember that? Oh, yeah.
Isn't that where you raise a different flag to pretend like you're safe?
Yeah.
As an individual? Okay. So Glover's...
Well, coming back, I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So Glover is a product of all of this in June of 75. He's already established himself as a leader in the Marblehead community, and he's a leader in the militia group that forms in Marblehead. And actually, a gentleman named Jeremiah Lee was the commander of the Marblehead Regiment in June when it was formed. But Jeremiah Lee had been out. He was with Hancock and a few others, John Hancock, when the British went out to Lexington and Concord. They were going after colonial arms, but they were also going after the leaders of the revolutionary movement, people like Sam Adams and John Hancock. And they were out eating in a tavern.
See, that's someone who else we can talk about is John Hancock. A lot of people, I think, know John Hancock from signing the Declaration of Independence as the largest signature, but he was a badass as well. He was sneaking things in during the Revolution.
He was a smuggler.
Yeah, a smuggler he brought arms and goods throughout the Revolution, right? And the British were searching for him constantly, right?
Yes, the British were always looking for John Hancock.
I think every time you tap that, the microphone picks it up.
Okay.
You go like that.
He was a big molasses smuggler. Now, after the French and Indian War, one of the big taxes was molasses came from the Caribbean. It's boiled down sugar and came in great big cakes, and they used it to sweeten things, and they used it to make rum. And rum was probably the most consumed beverage in America at the time. And so when the British started to tax it, Hancock was one of the molasses smugglers. They would sneak it in at night and stuff like that.
And rum was consumed. You're saying it was the most consumed in America at the time because we would put it in our water and such, right?
By the time of the American Revolution, every man, woman, and child over the age of 15 in the American colonies consumed as much as 7 ounces of rum a day because they put it in their water. They didn't know it well enough to put their wells and their septic tanks. They put them too close together because they didn't know anything about bacteria. And so water gave you a tummy ache. But if you put a little rum in it, it
kill the
you
bacteria.
didn't get sick, yeah.
Okay.
Especially when you were traveling. So
okay, so where were we?
So we were talking about Hancock. Hancock was a rum runner. Among his other things, he smuggled other things, and so he was
an entrepreneur.
Yeah, he was an 18th century entrepreneur in a lot of ways, not always legal. But the British were out looking for him in Lexington Concord. They were looking for Jeremiah Lee as well. Jeremiah Lee was with him. Jeremiah Lee was the original commander, and he died when he was at the tavern with Hancock and a few of the other rebel leaders when the British and Paul Revere warned them, and they got word that the British were marching out from Boston, and they left the tavern, but he fell and hurt himself, and then he got sick and he got pneumonia and he died around the time the regiment was being formed, and Glover got promoted to the colonel or the commander of the original Marblehead Regiment, and he stayed in that position until till Trenton, till the crossing of the Delaware.
Oh, he wasn't. And then what?
He went back to Marblehead, like so many of the Marblehead Regiment disbanded after the first Battle of Trenton.
Oh, I thought Glover stayed with Washington.
Glover went back. He had a lot of. His wife was sick, and he had a lot of things, business to tend to, and all that. He went back. Later in 77, Washington pleaded with him to come back. Congress wasn't crazy about him, so they wouldn't promote him to from colonel to brigadier general. In the latter part of 1776, when Glover fights the Battle of Pell's Point, when Glover comes down here, he's commanding a brigade, so he's commanding 5 regiments. But he was in a position of a brigadier general, but he was still a colonel, and Congress wouldn't. I misspoke. It was 4. He had 4 regiments. Congress wouldn't promote him to brigadier. Finally, Congress did, and Washington persuaded him to come back into the Continental Army later in 77, and they came back. But he was back in Marblehead for 7 months. But when we talk about, I want to tell this story of Battle of Pell's Point. Now, on August 28th, Glover performs. He oversees the evacuation of Brooklyn into Lower Manhattan. Rose 9,000. I think I said 900. I misspoke. 9,000 men horses, cannon, baggage across the Delaware, across the lower East River, where the Brooklyn Bridge is today, into where the Southport Seaport is in Manhattan. Saves Washington's army after the disastrous Battle of Brooklyn. And then, now we fast forward to October. That was August 28th. Now, in October, Washington's army they've fled across to Manhattan. They've fought their way in a fighting retreat up through Manhattan, and they're in northern Manhattan. And they're kind of trapped there because the British Navy has Manhattan Island surrounded. And there was a bridge called the King's Bridge in northern Manhattan into what is today the Bronx, called, that section of the Bronx today is called Kingsbridge, after the bridge. And there was a wooden bridge there, and that was the only way out of Manhattan. What General Cornwallis decided to do, he led the attack. He sailed out the East River, past LaGuardia Airport, under the Whitestone Bridge, and he landed in Frog's Neck, about 3 blocks from where I grew up, where Tremont Avenue ended at the East River. And that Tremont Avenue is called the Farmers Road. He was going to march up across the Bronx over to the area which is today called Kingsbridge and capture that bridge out of Manhattan, thereby trapping Washington and his entire army in Manhattan. And Cornwallis could easily starve him out now because there was no way to get supplies in and out. Washington only occupied the northern half of Manhattan. The British were in the southern half. And so Cornwallis is stopped at an area at the place called Westchester Creek, which is today Westchester Square. And a group of colonial fighters there's a bridge over this little creek. They rip up the wooden planks and they start firing cannons at. So Cornwallis goes back to the East River. He sails under the Throgs Neck Bridge. Of course, these bridges are around the tip of Throgs Neck up to what is modern-day Pelham Bay, and he's going to land there and march across the northern Bronx to take this bridge. He's still on that same mission. Washington sends Glover with 700 men, his brigade, basically, his 4 regiments, sends them out to a Pelham area, which at the time was called Pell's Point. Today it's called Pelham Bay.
Sends them out on foot or by?
Glover goes across the Bronx. He goes on foot.
Okay.
And he positions his men out there. He gets up one morning. He's up on a hill. There's a big rock he climbs up on with a spyglass, because they had spyglasses. And he looks out, and here come all these British bateaus, these little flat-bottom boats, are rowing ashore. Cornwallis landed with 4,000 men, British regulars and Hessian soldiers. Glover only had 700. And there was a road there called the Split Rock Road that's on what is today called the Split Rock Golf Course. Well, it's the Split Rock Road, and Cornwallis lands. And what Glover does, he's got 4 regiments. He takes 1 regiment and puts them on behind this stone wall, which is perpendicular to the road. The road kind of runs up in between these various stone walls that are perpendicular to it, marking off different farmers' fields. Glover has only got 700 men. Cornwallis has got 4,000. He puts 1 regiment behind this stone wall. Says, don't fire until they're like 20 yards away. Don't even hide. Don't even come up. The British march up. This 1st regiment pops up from behind this stone wall, rock wall, pops up, and they fire point blank at the British, surprise them. They actually get off 2 or 3 more shots, and then they begin running. When they get to the next stone wall, they jump over the wall and keep on running. But the 2nd regiment is lying on the ground, hiding behind that stone wall. So what do the British do when you run? They run after you. So the British and the Hessians continue after these retreating, and they get to the next wall, and these guys pop up and fire again point blank at the British. Now, you think the British would learn, but they run. The British run after them. There's a 3rd wall. The 3rd regiment is there. And when they're all done, they keep doing this to the British, but the British keep marching forward. When they're all done, they all retreated up onto a hill where there were 2 stone walls. The road came down the middle, and these 2 stone walls were perpendicular. And Glover had all of his regiments behind these walls, firing enfilade crossfires at the British. They finally drove the British back. Glover that day took 22 casualties, 7 killed, 13 wounded. Do the math. 7 killed, 14 wounded. The Cornwallis took 800 casualties because of the way that Glover had fired. And Cornwallis, instead of marching across the Bronx to take the King's Bridge and drop Washington and Manhattan Island, instead Cornwallis goes back to New Rochelle, where we were a few weeks ago. Oh, no, you never
Yeah, I go there.
Back to New Rochelle, and he camps there to lick his wounds, take care of his wounded, and bury his dead and all that. He's shocked at what's happened. He's lost about 20% of his force. And during that time, during that extra couple of days that Cornwallis took that little hiatus there in New Rochelle, Washington escaped from Manhattan Island over the King's Bridge up to White Plains, where they would then subsequently fight the Battle of White Plains.
So that's how he helped him escape.
But yes, Glover showed his tactical genius by how he positioned his troops and the orders that he gave them, and to be able to inflict 800 casualties versus 22 in the face of a far superior force was one of the more remarkable tactical achievements of the American Revolution. So we come back to, where are there men like that?
That's a madman to convince your 700 men to fight 4,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild.
And beat them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when you're saying that the British start marching, so when the British get off these ships and they're going to start marching down, they're always prepared to fight.
Yes.
So when they are marching, they're prepared to fight always. It's not, we don't march unless you guys are, powder in hand, muskets.
Oh, the British are carrying they all have haversacks, and they have cartouches, cartridge boxes, and they have their muskets. Now, they wouldn't get off the ship with a loaded musket. They would, when they got, you've played around in these Rev War battles, and when you get close, so you get within 50 yards of something, the enemy, that's when you prime and load.
Yeah.
But they're not carrying loaded muskets, but otherwise they're ready to prime and load and shoot pretty quickly.
So the war's already started. The British are just always thinking that they're going to be attacked at this point.
This is this event at Pell's Point is October of 76.
So they think that this guerrilla warfare tactic that Glover's doing, they're always going to be prepared for this now?
I'm not sure how much they learned from it. The reason the British learned a lot from Bunker Hill. First thing they learned, some of the British learned, I'm not sure all of them did. They learned a man always fights more fiercely for his own home than a stranger fights for somebody else's home. And secondly, they learned that the Americans were extraordinarily tenacious when in a well-fortified position. So the British never tried to storm a hill. Again, we could Google here the precise numbers of Bunker Hill, but
I don't know much about Bunker Hill. I just know
the British lost around 1,000 men to about a little over 200 Americans, and the British at the time only had like 10,000 men in North America. And
oh wow, that's 10%.
And the British general at the time said, a couple more victories like this, and we'll lose the war for sure, because they learned the Americans fight very well in a well fortified position. Bunker Hill, what happened was they only had the Americans only had 3 rounds each, because they didn't have powder and they didn't have musket balls.
But you're saying they charged up, did the Americans hold
the British
high
made
ground?
3 charges, and the Americans waited. Remember the expression, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes?
Yes, I do. That's from Bunker Hill?
That's Bunker Hill, Israel Putnam.
Now, so if they would have made one more charge.
The British made the last charge, and the Americans had to break it.
But if they would have made a 4th. Oh, they made a 4th charge.
The Americans had unlimited, a full cartridge box. I don't know, the British would have had to stop eventually because they kept getting driven back.
And you're saying that's a bayonet charge. That's what you're saying, to charge?
No, well, once the Americans ran out of ammo.
Yeah, but you're saying the British are charging. Are they charging with bayonets?
Oh, they're marching up the hill to within, just like normal, to within 30, 40 yards, and then they're shooting. But the Americans are hidden behind these redoubts that they've built, And so the British shot is ineffective because the Americans are behind shields, barriers. And the Americans wait until the British are right there and fire point blank. So they made their shots count. And the British would lose so many in each charge, they'd turn around and go back down the hill and then try it again.
What were they trying to take during that battle?
Bunker Hill was really Breed's Hill that they fought on, but that's a hill over Boston. And the Americans had gone up and occupied that hill just north of Boston. And they could bring in cannons and lob cannons down on not only the city of Boston, but the British fleet was out in Boston Harbor. So the British forces in Boston, as well as the British fleet, were on great risk if the Continentals held that lovely high ground on the north side of Boston.
And the cannons would reach from Breed Hill down to the ships?
So the British wanted to clear them out of that hill because it was put their whole force in danger.
Why couldn't they just go to another port?
The British?
Yeah.
Oh, Boston was one
port.
of the finest ports in North America.
Okay.
And no, that wasn't a Boston was it was a little island with a long, skinny, like an isthmus that ran in to Boston. Now, in modern days, they filled in the Boston, they call it the Back Bay. They filled in and connected Boston to everything else, but it was a little island with a skinny road through a swamp that connected it to everything else. So you were kind of trapped out there. Everything had to come in by water, and so it was real easy to put Boston under siege, which Washington did.
Okay.
So that's October. The Battle of Pills Point's October of 75.
Wait, is Washington with Glover at this during Pills Point? Oh, yeah. Okay, you told me where Washington was. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was October of 76. And Glover, that's the second time that he, quote, saved Washington, because he gave Washington the extra couple of days he needed to escape from Manhattan Island.
And the first one was Connecticut?
The first time was the Battle of Brooklyn.
Okay.
Where he rode 9,000 men, horses, cannon, baggage, across a mile of the lower East River under the cover of darkness with the British fleet in New York Harbor. But the wind was blowing down the East River, so they couldn't sail up. They couldn't get up the mouth of the East River from the harbor. And then a dense fog rolled in the morning, gave Glover another hour or two of cover. And he got all the men out of Brooklyn, saved Washington's army. So that was the second time. So, I mean, that was the first time, Brooklyn. The second time was Pills Point. And now, after the Battle of White Plains, which was fought in November of 76, the army is kind of split into two. Washington comes down out of Fort Lee with certain portion of the army, and then Charles Lee, who was a former British general, is now commanding the other division of Washington's army, and he wants Washington's job. He thinks he should be commander-in-chief instead of Washington. He was kind of a pompous jerk, Charles Lee.
Did he have any accolades that would say he could do it?
He was a well-credentialed British general. Had come over to the American side.
And would we trust him?
Well, Washington found out he shouldn't. So Washington is constantly sending him orders to come down and join Washington here on the banks of the Delaware, where he's now going to take another stand. And Lee was stalling. He wouldn't come down. And then in northern New Jersey by Branchburg Park, what's the name of the town he was in, Lee is chasing a couple of early American roving hostesses, a couple of tavern ladies, several miles from his army. He's out there gallivanting in this tavern with some of his tavern ladies, and up rides none other than Bannister Tolson, the guy from The Patriot.
Oh, wait, the bad guy?
Yeah, the bad British guy rides up and captures...
Oh, he's a real figure?
He captures Charles Lee in New Jersey, and...
by himself while he's in the tavern?
Yeah, he's in the tavern. He doesn't have anybody guarding him, and they capture him. Now, Sullivan becomes the commander of this wing of the army, and Sullivan marches swiftly down to the banks, brings the army under Washington's orders, and he brings them down right away. But Charles Lee was stalling because he didn't want to do what Washington wanted to do, and he wanted Washington's job.
How did they treat him once they called him?
With a great deal of respect. He would dine with the British generals at night, and it's just what they did back then.
Oh, yeah, but wouldn't he be considered a traitor to the British at that time?
He had retired from the British Army and come over to America and became, he was, I don't think the British would have trusted. They weren't going to make him a British general again.
Because didn't this happen kind of often during the, I mean, you have the Loyalist.
Benedict Arnold.
He's the most famous one, who I feel like everyone knows him as just a
famous traitor. And the British had promised him a commission in the British Army. And then when he finally got out of America and escaped to Britain, they said, no, you're a traitor. We don't trust you. We're not going to make you an officer in our army.
But he always wasn't a bad guy. Wasn't he kind of a well-decorated individual?
Oh, Benedict Arnold was one of the Washington's finest generals.
See, I feel like he gets a bad rap just because of the bad thing that he did.
Oh, he did. It was really bad what he did.
Out of
Washington wanted him caught and killed. Washington was furious because he had trusted himself.
They found him with papers at West Point? Is that
he turned the plans to West Point over because the British wanted to take West Point. Well, but Charles Lee is a POW, but he's a general, and he's a British general and now an American general, and the British are treating him with respect. And eventually he was freed in a prisoner swap. Charles Lee was turned back to the Americans in a prisoner swap. At any rate, so General Sullivan takes the army and brings them down, and they don't arrive here in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, until about the 21st, 22nd of December. This is a couple of days prior to the crossing of the Delaware. And Glover is with Sullivan's column. So that's when Glover gets to Pennsylvania. And he camps up by Jericho Mountain. Washington has taken over a house.
Like Jericho, like going towards New
Jericho
Hope?
Country Club, yeah.
Yeah, right there at Brownsburg.
Yeah, Wrightstown Road comes into Eagle Road, and that's right where Glover was camped. And Washington had set up his headquarters on Jericho Creek at the base of Jericho Mountain on Wrightstown Road. And that building is there today. It's called Headquarters House, and it's owned by Joe Wesley, who was the founder of Amquip, the big crane company.
Okay.
It's a beautiful piece of property. That's where Washington was headquartered. And he summons Glover. This is somewhere around the 21st, 22nd of December. Washington has been fomenting this plan to cross the Delaware and attack the Hessians in Trenton. Been turning it over in his mind, but of course the problem he had was getting across the Delaware River in the winter. River's full of ice, and there's all these reasons why you shouldn't do it. It was not in anybody's playbook. It was not considered a viable military tactic at the time. You just didn't.
Right?
Yeah, you just didn't do it.
Now, the British are thinking that it's not in anyone's
And the
playbook.
Hessians, of course, are guarding Trenton. They're thinking the same thing. So Washington summons Glover to his headquarters, and he tells him what he wants to do. He wants to cross 800 feet of an ice-strewn rocky river under the cover of darkness. And, oh, by the way, the barometer's falling. They had barometers back then, which meant low pressure, which usually meant a storm. And, by the way, a storm may be rolling in, and, we could be seeing snow and ice and rain and all that. He tells Glover what he wants to do. And this is part legend, part citation. Exactly what he said, we're not sure, but roughly, Glover says to Washington, Your Excellency, it is impossible. And Washington said, Colonel Glover, I did not ask you to assess possibilities. I asked you if you could do it. And Glover thought for a moment, and he said, General Washington, my Marbleheaders can do it. And legend tells us that's when Washington made the final decision to cross the Delaware on Christmas night in 1776.
So on Jericho Mountain, he made that decision.
Yeah.
Not far from Bowman's Tower. So that'd be kind of
very close to Bowman's Tower. Yeah.
Okay. So then they make it. Now they march back down to Washington's Crossing. Now where are they? They're camped out there.
Yeah, they're camped way up.
So that's not too far, but that's 5 miles.
It's a couple of miles, probably 2 or 3 miles. But remember, the roads weren't good, and there was snow, and you're watching through woods in some cases, so it wasn't an easy march. So the Marbleheaders they're going to cross Christmas night. On Christmas Eve, they have to come down and get all the boats down the river. Washington had ordered anything that floated on the Delaware, which was primarily the Durham boats, ferries, any other rivercraft. He had ordered them taken to the Pennsylvania side to prevent the British from using them because he didn't want the British to cross and attack his forces. But now the Marbleheaders are up all Christmas Eve. They're up bringing down the boats and putting them behind the different islands around the crossing point. And then they get up Christmas morning and they have to be out. They continue to position the boats. They're doing some back and forth across the river doing tests. And so they're working all day getting the boats ready. And the crossing is supposed to begin at 4 o'clock because Washington wanted to do the crossing under cover of darkness. And in that time of the year, it gets dark around 4:15. But as usual, like any operation in the Army, it always gets delayed. And so they don't really start till around 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Now, Glover's men row 2,400 of Washington's men, horses, cannon, baggage. They bring the ferries across. They row the men across in the boats. It all takes about 8 to 9 hours before they finally, and they're rowing constantly. Now, you've rowed that boat, and you know what it's like. Can you imagine doing that for 9 hours in a northeaster with snow and ice and rain blowing in your face all the time?
Exhausting.
And then the Glover's and his men.
Any boats lost during that?
No.
That's insane. We lost a boat on the reenactment, pretty much. I mean, we didn't lose the boat, but, taken by wind a little bit, had to be rescued.
Right. On the way back, a boat tipped over with the Hessians in it, but that's a little bit ahead in the story. Yeah. So then they all marched to Trenton. Washington wanted to get there before sunrise for this element of surprise, but he got there 45 minutes to an hour after sunrise. 2 columns attack Trenton. Washington with General Greene's column attacks Trenton from the north, and General Sullivan's column with Glover in the vanguard, that means out in front of the column, is going to come up along the river and come up from the south to attack Trenton. When they get there, there was a bridge over the Assunpink Creek. The Assunpink Creek is a deep, swift-running creek, and you've probably seen over there in Trenton.
I've defended it.
It's underneath. Yeah, we fought the Battle of Trenton, and it's not. You couldn't just walk across it in the winter. It's pretty deep and cold, and runs very fast. But there was a bridge over the Assunpink, and that was the only escape route to the south for the Hessians. Glover takes his men. He crosses that bridge and forms up on the south bank of the Assunpink, and prevents the Hessians from escaping south. The battle lasts about 45 minutes. The Hessians surrender. The Hessians suffer basically about 100 casualties, and most of them killed. And the Americans really only have a couple of casualties. No, they don't have anybody killed, but they have a couple wounded. One of the wounded was William Washington, Washington's nephew, and another of the wounded was a young Virginia artillery officer by the name of James Monroe, who would go on to become the 6th president of the United States.
Now, wait, are we fighting any British at Trenton, or is it just Hessians?
There were 16 British dragoons at Trenton that fled as soon as the shooting started. They fled down to up toward Princeton.
So we fought just Hessians.
It was all Hessians. So now, amongst the Hessian stores, this was very common in this day, the armies traveled with rum. And they traveled with, because each soldier would get a jigger, a ration of rum every night. That was part of the procedures. And so among the Hessian stores, Washington's men discovered 30 hogshead of rum. Now, a hogshead's like a 55-gallon drum. It's pretty big. Now, these guys, poor guys, they lost the battles in New York. They'd retreated across New Jersey. It's like they had the biggest losing season in NFL history, and now they just won the Super Bowl.
Okay.
And, so they're feeling pretty festive, and they're into the rum. And Washington hears about the rum, and he orders the rum immediately disposed of. And the men say, well, the general wants all this rum disposed of. Now, there's several ways we can do this.
Okay.
And so the men were deeply into this captured rum, and they were exhausted. And now they're slamming down shots of Jamaican rum. And Washington realizes this, and he says, we are now going to march back up the river and cross back to Pennsylvania, because there are 8,000 British regulars a day's march away at Princeton.
Yeah, you missed the part. After they get off the boats, they have to march from Titusville?
9 miles.
9 miles down Titusville to Trenton.
Correct.
And then Trenton now back.
Now they got to turn around and march back up. And now they've got 800 Hessian prisoners with them as well. And they march back up. And so the Marbleheaders now not only row Washington's 2,400 men back, but they also row the 900 Hessian prisoners.
Wait, so why did we cross back over the Delaware just to cross back over to go to Princeton?
We cross back over to put the Delaware between Washington's army and the 8,000 British regulars in Princeton.
Because we end up fighting the Battle of Princeton.
We end up a couple days later, 10 days later, we go back and we fight the... I can get into that, but just keep. So the Marbleheaders had they had really almost been up since Christmas Eve, and now it's like 2 days after Christmas, and they've been up for probably somewhere on the order of 60, 70 hours. They've marched 9 miles each way, 18 miles. They fought a decisive battle. They have rowed probably for, total 15, 16, 17 hours. And they're completely exhausted. And some of them are going to sleep under the stars, and they finally just go to sleep. And I always say, where do we find such men? Are there such guys like that today?
And it's freezing out.
And it's cold. And so, you say, we have Navy SEALs today, and we have Rangers, and we have, but we had guys like that back then.
That's what I'm saying. And they just picked up and took the orders, and they went marching. They didn't question it. They didn't do anything. They just, all right, they got up and they went.
This is what was so interesting about the men that crossed the Delaware. Not just the Marbleheaders, but all of the soldiers. When Washington crossed the Delaware, he was down to about 5,000 men. He had 20,000 in New York. That's how many he had lost who were captured, killed and wounded in fighting, and desertions. Desertions were a huge problem. He was down to about 5,000 men. He had 2,400 at Washington's Crossing. These men weren't fighting for a king. They weren't fighting for dirt. They weren't fighting for land. They weren't fighting for money. They went out mercenaries. And they weren't even fighting for a country because they didn't have one yet. They were fighting for a set of ideals, and those ideals that were articulated in the Declaration of Independence. So that's very interesting. Rarely in the course of war and the long march of human endeavor in history, did you have men who were solely fighting for a small, important set of ideals and set of principles.
And these men, they were at Pell's Point and they were in Brooklyn and now they're in Pennsylvania and Jersey, where are they from?
Marblehead.
All those, the only men fighting are Marbleheaders?
No, the Marblehead Regiment had 249 effectives for the crossing of the Delaware. Oh, there were 2,400 men. They were from all over.
That's crazy. So these men are also marching.
From Virginia, the Carolinas, all the way up to New Hampshire.
That's hundreds of miles that all these people are fighting. Now they're not even fighting for dirt because it's not even their dirt right now at the moment. Yeah. They're from New Hampshire, wherever you're saying.
In other words, they're not fighting to conquer another country. They're not fighting for land. They're fighting for principles.
Yeah.
And the principles are all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the kind of things they were fighting for.
And you think they all believe this?
They had to still be there.
Yeah.
To still be there after all of that discouragement, disappointment, defeat, suffering. After all that suffering, they're now going to, and they knew they were going to Trenton. And they go, this is not going to be easy.
But now there's got to be some type of fear that if those individuals were to desert or if we lose the war, was the British implementing anything of if we find out that you're fighting for the colony, we're going to come out and get you type of fear that they were instilling?
During the retreat across New Jersey, the British had announced if you signed an allegiance to the king, even though if you fought in the colonial army, you would be free. You would be not charged with anything.
And is that when you were considered a loyalist?
Yeah, and so, but very few of them did. Some of them did. There were some soldiers who, and just citizens in New Jersey, because they were retreating across New Jersey. The British wanted to get all the citizens to sign this oath of allegiance to the king. And some people did, but...
were they forced to sign?
Well, if you don't sign it and you lose the war, it's not going to go well for you.
Well, would they knock on your door? Would they come around knocking on your door and say, sign it?
Yeah, coming around asking people to sign it.
That sounds kind of forced signature.
So a lot of people may have signed just out of fear for themselves, their families, their land. So they did. The British were... The commanding officer in North America at the time was Howe. Richard Howe. He's an admiral, and his brother was the Army general. Howe kind of felt like he had a mandate to pacify America, not just come over and kick butt and conquer it, but to pacify it. So Howe was always looking for a way to make nice. It was General Howe who said during the American Revolution, it's very interesting. He said, one third of the Americans are loyal to the Continental Congress. They're fighting for the cause. 1/3 of the Americans are loyal to the king, and the other third of the Americans don't care. They don't care who's in charge. He said, why should 1/3 tell the other 2/3 what they have to do? Which was an interesting, but that's usually the case in revolutions. It's usually a certain percentage of the population that actually fights.
I think it's a case today too.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So Howe was actually looking. He felt he had a bit of a mandate to try to pacify the colonies rather than just bloody their nose, rather than just beat them up, beat them into submission. So he was looking for ways to do that. Now, let's say Washington's army got captured, and there was no left to fight the British, and what would the British have done with the signatories to the Declaration of Independence? Would they have imprisoned them? Would they have hung them? Or would they have just simply commuted pardoned their crimes? Because they were considered traitors to the king. Or
terrorists. I feel like they'd be like terrorists to the king.
And they didn't use the word back then, but if they had the word back then, it was used in that. The way it is today, the British considered the American forces as terrorists. Yeah.
Now, you're saying that we keep talking about Washington and such. Is there other battles going on at the time during Washington, or are they just chasing Washington and chasing Washington?
Washington, at that point in time, is the Continental Army. Now, he did have some smaller units in different places. He left some forces in Boston. He left some forces in Rhode Island. He had some forces up the Hudson in the area of modern-day West Point. So he did have some units. And then there were other state militia units around. But as far as basically all the fighting was taking place between Washington's army and the British Army.
So is it really Cornwallis versus Washington, kind of this whole...
Correct.
This whole war?
Yeah, well, after you see, just prior to the Battle of Trenton, Cornwallis, his wife was sick, she was dying, and he was going back to England to see her. And Washington attacked at Trenton. Cornwallis was on a boat getting ready to sail back to England, and Cornwallis wasn't the main general. He was never the commander in chief of the British armies. He was always second or third in command. Cornwallis was ordered off the boat back down to Princeton to take over the British forces and do something about this, the fall of Trenton. And that's where we have the Second Battle of Trenton. Cornwallis is now there and attacks Trenton the second time.
We win or lose that one?
That was the one where Washington had set up his defenses on the south bank of the Assunpink, what the Hessian soldiers had told him they should have done. And he does that, and he fights. The British actually are held off by American forces trying to march into Trenton. They get to Trenton like 4 p.m. They attack the bridge over the Assunpink, and you've been there.
Oh, so the British now are part of the second battle. The Hessians are all captured, and you're saying that the Hessian leader is now having dinner with Washington or something and saying, this is what I would have done?
Yeah, no, the Hessians that were in Trenton are captured, but there were Hessian units in Bordentown, Mount Holly, and there were some Hessians up at Princeton. So there's still a lot of Hessians. So Cornwallis comes down and he makes 3 assaults on the bridge. He has to cross the bridge because that's where the Americans are. He makes 3 assaults on the bridge and he's driven back. Takes a lot of casualties. And now it's getting dark. And Cornwallis says, we'll bag that old fox Washington in the morning. Because now Washington's got his back to the Delaware. He doesn't have boats to get across. Washington's in a tough position. And what he does is he holds a council of war, sits around with his generals. And Washington had a great gift. Cornwallis held a council of war, and they decided they were going to go upstream, up the Assunpink, where there was a ford where they could walk across and come down and flank Washington. And all the British officers would sit around and say to Cornwallis, brilliant, sub, brilliant, absolutely brilliant idea. They would all say that. Washington's Council of War, they're all arguing. They're all individual entrepreneurs, and they all have a different idea. But Washington had a gift for taking all those ideas, coming up with a plan, and making everybody think it was their idea. And so what Washington's men do is, he has men swinging axes all night, building big bonfires like they're building redoubts, building defensive positions out of wood and fences and trees and all that, making noise. And his army sneaks out up an old farmer's road, and they go up to Princeton, and that's when they fight the Battle of Princeton. So Washington escapes out from underneath Cornwallis's nose. Basically, Washington prevails. There is no clear victor in the Second Battle of Trenton, but he drives the British back 3 times, and the British go to bed for the night.
And sneaking out isn't just they walked away, because I have been with you just to take down one tent, right? I mean, they're sneaking out is...
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. They got to gather all the supplies.
And it had been cold on Christmas, but a warm spell had come in, and the ground was kind of muddy. And then that night, the temperature dropped dramatically and the ground froze again, and they were able to roll these wagons down this old farmer's road. Otherwise, it would have been hard to move the wagons through the mud. And they actually wrapped the wagon wheels in rags to muffle the sounds of the wagon wheels. And they got up to Princeton. They basically won the Battle of Princeton.
Wait, why Princeton? What were they doing in Princeton?
Well, Cornwallis's rear guard was stationed in Princeton. Cornwallis had left a brigade, or a battalion rather, behind that would be his reinforcements. But he now called them down to Trenton for this final assault. And so on the morning of January 2nd, January 2nd, I believe it was, or 3rd, 2nd or 3rd. They fought the Second Battle of Princeton. They marched all night. So it's the morning of January 3rd. Washington's army now is marching up past Trenton, and they're escaping, and they run into the British regiment that's coming down to reinforce Cornwallis, and they fight the Second Battle of Trenton they fight the Battle of Princeton, and basically defeat the British regiment that's there. Take a lot of prisoners, and then they go north to Morristown, where they go into winter quarters.
Winter quarters mean they're not fighting during the winter.
Correct.
They took time off.
Most armies didn't fight in the winter.
See, that's something that you never hear about either. They
Well-
take time off during the.
Well, they
during
don't
war?
fight because the conditions in the winter.
No
just-
peace treaties are trying to be made during this.
No, well, they were. Yeah, no, but
Men aren't dispersing and trying to go home.
now Cornwallis, he's getting ready to attack Trenton. The sun comes up. It's right around sunrise. The Battle of Princeton takes place. The sun comes up. Cornwallis looks out across the Assunpink and nobody's there. And then he starts hearing in the distance, you can hear those cannons a long way away. He's going boom, boom. He hears the cannons going off, which is the Battle of Princeton. He goes, ow, they escaped. He gets his men together as quickly as possible and marches the shortest road back up to Princeton, which meant he had to cross the Stony Brook, and there was a wooden bridge over it, and the colonials had pulled up all of the boards off the bridge. So Cornwallis didn't have a bridge across that creek. So he got stymied there, and he almost got up to Washington, but he didn't. And then
It sounds like they're fighting on their home turf a lot, the colonists, and
yeah, that makes a big difference. Washington had breakfast with a gentleman named Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton. And he is like the great-great-great-great-grandparent of Reese Witherspoon today.
That's neat.
Washington stopped to have breakfast with the president. Princeton was just one building at the time. And he had breakfast with him while everybody was packing up. And then after he was finished breakfast, they marched up to Morristown.
Okay. Now,
so now Cornwallis gets back to Princeton, and Washington's gone, and Washington's got he took all the baggage, British stuff out of Princeton that he needed, food supplies and things like that. Cornwallis is now really shaken up by this. Not only did they lose the first Battle of Trenton, now they did not succeed in capturing Washington. And not only that, Washington's still alive and in New Jersey. Cornwallis marches all the way back up to Perth Amboy.
Whoa, that's far.
Goes back and basically gives up the whole state of New Jersey.
This sounds like a chase movie. So it's like they're fighting, chasing. Washington gets out. Now they chase him again.
After the Battle of Long Island, where Washington situated 7,000 men on a hill, British attacked with 20,000. Washington made a lot of mistakes in the American Revolution, but he never made the same mistake twice. And he said, we're not going to fight them on their terms. We're going to fight the British. They're going to fight on our terms. So the British, they did. For the rest of the American Revolution, the British basically were pursuing the Americans, and the Americans waited till they had the ground, the hill, the high ground, the land that they wanted to fight on in many instances.
Because this is the beginning of the war still, because you have 5 more years left of the war after this, right? Or 4?
So this is now early 77. The war ends in 81, so 4 more years. Now, there's an interesting statistic, and you can probably Google it, but the British Army, the American Army, when they were on the march, moved like 2 miles an hour. I think even a little more, like 2.25 miles an hour, because they were light. They didn't carry a lot of excess baggage like the Brits did. The British Army only moved at like 1 mile an hour when you had a whole army moving. So they would only march 10 miles in a day for 10 hours. So the Brits were never really able to catch up to the Americans. When gentleman Johnny Burgoyne came into Seattle, he marched down from Montreal, came down the St. Lawrence River, and he was going to march down the Hudson Valley and attack New York from the north. He was going to cut off the head of the snake, cut off the New England colonies. That resulted in the Battle of Saratoga, which was another turning point in the war. When gentleman General Burgoyne, left Montreal, he had 30 wagons of champagne in his baggage train, because he'd like to have a little champagne every night, and his officers. And so when you're worrying about hauling 30 wagons of champagne around, you're just not moving that fast.
No.
You're not that agile. So that was down in Carolina when Cornwallis is now chasing Greene. This is later in the war. Finally, once Cornwallis left a bunch of his baggage behind so that he could catch up to Greene, that resulted in one of the battles down in the South. But Cornwallis finally did that. He said, just leave everything behind and we're going to march so we can march. We can finally catch these guys.
With Glover, he's now where?
So Glover, all right, so now this is the beginning of 1777. Glover and almost the entire Marblehead Regiment. Now, the enlistments of about 90% of Washington's men expired at the end of 76. So after the first Battle of Trenton, these guys are going to go home. Washington comes down with some money and gives a speech and he says, stay with me another month. And most of the soldiers do, but the Marbleheaders and Glover go back to Marblehead. But one of the reasons motivating them, they wanted to go become privateers. They were dedicated to the cause, but, they had homes and families and businesses. They wanted to get back home, but for many of them, they would go back to Marblehead and join privateer crews because you had a chance to make some money. You weren't making any money being an infantryman and man in 76, 77. And so Glover goes back home. He corresponds with Washington. Washington persuades him to come back, and Congress finally gives him his one star, his first star, makes him a brigadier general. Now, Glover does some very interesting things in the latter, throughout the rest of the American Revolution. Glover is actually now, we mentioned Benedict Arnold. Mm-hmm. He, along with Major Andre, who was this debonair young British, very popular British officer who became a British spy, Arnold was conspiring with Major Andre to get these plans. And Andre came up, met Arnold, and then he was escaping. Now, there's something you just didn't do. If you were a spy, if they thought you were a spy, they just hung you right away during an 18th century warfare. They had a summary trial, which was an officer saying, you're a spy, hang him in the morning. And Andre was caught. He was a British officer, major. He was caught in civilian clothes, escaping down the east side of the Hudson, trying to get back to New York with the plans for West Point, so the British could attack. And he gets captured by a couple of New York militiamen, and they find the plans hidden in his boot, but he's in civilian clothes, and they now realize he's an officer, and you didn't do that. You didn't change into civilian clothes and try to sneak through the lines. That was a hanging offense, just back then. Well, anyway, Andre, Clinton was the British commanding officer in New York. Clinton pleaded with Washington to free Andre because he really liked Andre. He was a fast burner, up-and-coming officer in the British Army and dapper kind of a guy. And Clinton pleaded with him, I'll give you anybody, please don't hang him. Washington said, you didn't give Nathan Hale that consideration. You hung him. You wouldn't even give him a Bible. When he was waiting to be hung, he asked for a Bible, and the British wouldn't give him one. And he said, you didn't cut Nathan Hale any slack. Why should I cut Andre some slack? So
that sounds like he gave him some slack.
He gave him slack. He was. The line wasn't very slack. Well, at any rate, Glover sat on the court-martial for Major Andre. Mm-hmm. And there is another story I'm going to tell about.
How do you fight through all those battles and then still let that guy go free? Do they let him go free?
No, they hung Andre.
Oh, they hung Andre. Okay.
And Glover was the officer of the day when they hung him. So Glover was the one to march him out and order the executioner to, I don't know how they put him on a horse probably and smack the horse in the butt. The horse, they
didn't just kick out the stool from underneath him?
Something like that, yeah. But so it was Glover who would have given that. But so now, that was later in the war. I'm backtracking a little bit now to the fall, September of 77. We're now at Saratoga, okay?
Okay.
And the mid 77, Clinton, who's in New York, he's the commanding general. Cornwallis is under Clinton. Clinton decides he's going to capture Philadelphia because they considered Philadelphia to be the capital, but the Americans didn't think it was the capital because it was just the place in the middle where they met. But in European warfare, if you captured the capital, you won the war. So Clinton says we're going to sail out of New York into Chesapeake, up the Chesapeake, land south of Philly, march up and attack and capture Philadelphia, and the war will be over. But that didn't work because the Americans said, you can have Philadelphia. It doesn't mean anything to most of us unless you lived in Philadelphia. But in the meantime, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne had persuaded the king, he was very good friends with the king, had persuaded the king that the way to win the war was for him to sail down the St. Lawrence River to Montreal, march down through New York, and capture the whole Hudson Valley, thereby, in his words, cutting off the head of the snake, cutting off the New England colonies from the southern colonies, and that would also hasten the end of the war. So Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, the king liked the idea and gave him permission to do it, but he was counting on Clinton coming up from New York and supporting him. But Clinton didn't like that idea. Clinton said, I'm going down to take Philly. So Clinton was not there to support Burgoyne. Burgoyne got as far as Saratoga, and he met the American army at Saratoga. The army that was there, because Washington also fought Cornwallis at Brandywine, south of Philly, when Clinton was trying to take Philly from the south up the Chesapeake. And so the other American army now is up there in Saratoga. And Benedict Arnold is one of the generals there who comports himself with incredible bravery and dignity. And he's, at any rate, Burgoyne, Saratoga really took place over a couple of days. There were several smaller battles. And basically what happened was Burgoyne realizes Clinton's not coming to his rescue. He's trapped there. He's running low on supplies, and he can't. It's now September, and he can't march back to Montreal because it's going to be winter soon. And so Burgoyne surrenders to the Americans with 5,000 men. And that was considered, besides Trenton, the other main turning point in the American Revolution. Because what happened was, after Saratoga, the French formally entered the war on the side of the Americans. Because they looked at it and they said, if you can win that kind of a battle, capture 5,000 British, you got to be doing something right.
What are you doing with 5,000 British, though? Like, what are they?
Okay, well, that's what the story I'm getting to. This is where Glover gets involved. So they surrender, and they give their parole of honor. Burgoyne and his 5,000 men are going to march from Saratoga, New York, all the way across Massachusetts to Boston, and they're going to get on British ships and go back to England and sign a parole of honor that they're going to march there by themselves, and they're never going to come back and fight in America. That was the terms of the surrender. Glover is now put in charge of marching these 5,000 men all the way back, pre-OWs, all the way back to Boston. He and Burgoyne, because Burgoyne's really their commander, so he and Burgoyne, in terms of the surrender, are going to march these guys all the way back. And he and Burgoyne become good friends. They're stopping all along the way. I mean, they'd only march like 10 miles a day. You know, it's a pretty long way from Saratoga, New York to Boston, the whole length of Massachusetts and then some. And so Burgoyne and Glover now are stopping in taverns every night, and they become best buddies. And they decide they have a plan to end the American Revolution and get everybody what they want. Burgoyne's going to go back and talk to the King of England because he's his friend, and Glover's going to go talk to the Continental Congress, and they were going to present their plan on how to end the American Revolution, and everybody gets what they want. So a couple of days, I don't know, this thing took weeks, but a few weeks into this march, Glover and Burgoyne are in a tavern in Massachusetts, and they realize they don't know where the army is, the 5,000 men. They're now separated by like 80 or 100 miles from the rest of the army, and they're not sure where they are. And they're because they've been spending all this time carousing and drinking and fomenting this plan to end the American Revolution, and they lose the army.
Okay.
Which I think that's a wonderful Glover story.
They have to go back and find them?
So then they have to go back and find the army, and the army eventually makes it to Boston, and British ships are sent in, and they go back to
Where were the
England.
5,000 men?
They were like 80 miles north of them or something like
80
that.
miles is
Yeah.
possibly 8 days.
Hmm?
Just two men just trying
Yeah,
to go
yeah.
hiking through the woods trying to find the men?
They were pretty far away, yeah.
Wow. So now this is what year?
This is late 77, early 78.
And then is Glover...
Now, it's after that Glover's at West Point, and when Major Andre is captured.
So now Glover marches these 5,000 men back.
Right.
And now he stays in Marblehead? He stays in Boston?
No, now he comes back and joins the American Army, and after that, he actually fought in Rhode Island. There was some fighting between the British and the colonists in Rhode Island. Glover participated in that, and then he ended up at West Point.
And now what year does he end up at West Point? Oh, does he become the commander of West Point? Is that something that I know?
He is... I'm not sure if he's actually the commander, but he's a high-ranking guy at I think he might have been considered in command of the fort at West Point.
So after all this is towards the end of the war now?
Yeah, this is probably 79, 80 in that area, yeah.
And
The war now, the fighting in the American Revolution has all shifted south now. It's all taking place. It starts in Savannah.
what?
Yeah, there's fighting in Savannah, Camden, all throughout North and South Carolina, and it ends up in Yorktown, which is where the Cornwallis surrenders with 8,000 men.
Why is it went south? Why did it go south?
After the French entered the war, something really significant happened. The British were afraid that now that the French were fighting, now the French were at war with Britain, that they would go to the Caribbean and take some of the choice British possessions in the Caribbean. And they were valuable. You know, what was New England worth? You got timber and codfish out of England. And it took a lot of ships to move timber and codfish. But if you went down, you could get, 20 barrels of nutmeg was worth what a whole shipload of timber was worth. The stuff that came out of the Caribbean, molasses, spices, things like nutmeg, were extremely valuable per pound. British didn't want to lose those. The British almost say, you can have New England, we want the islands and the Caribbean because there's more money there. So Clinton took 10,000 of his men, and the British Army was primarily in New York at this time, 10,000 of his men, and sent them to the Caribbean to defend the British possessions in the Caribbean. That was very significant. Not only were the French going to enter on the side of the Americans, but the British force in the colonies was significantly depleted because of that. And now the next thing Clinton decided, that there were a lot more loyalists in the South, in North and South Carolina, for instance. And if he decided he was going to send his army down to kind of create an uprising amongst those loyalists and hold those southern states. And that would also take away, if you could get Virginia south, you would be cutting the colonies in half, and that would also hasten the end of the war. But nobody had really looked at a map, because now the British are fighting. When you talk about from New York all the way down to like Savannah, Georgia, that's an area like from London to Athens.
It's like 1,000 miles.
It's an area that they just had never thought they were fighting over such a wide span. And from traveling up and down the East Coast, you travel 95, every 5 miles, there's an estuary. 95 just goes over it. You
Sure.
don't think of it.
Especially in the South, yeah.
But if you're marching an army down, you got to cross all those estuaries.
Or go around them.
Yeah, or go inland or find a way around them and things like that. So it was a terrible place. It infested with mosquitoes and snakes and diseases. And it was a really horrible place to chase the American army around. But that's what happened. So the Clinton still kept a significant force in New York. He was always going to defend New York Harbor. But he sent Cornwallis with the bulk of the British Army into the South. And Cornwallis fought a series of campaigns. The Americans were largely successful, which culminated in now Cornwallis is working his way from the Deep South up, and he's got to find, and Cornwallis orders him to find a place somewhere around the Chesapeake where he can be resupplied from New York, and they decide on Yorktown, and Cornwallis marches his army into Yorktown, but he's up against the York River, and he subsequently does not get rescued by Clinton from New York, and he's trapped there, and the day before Cornwallis surrenders, and now at this point, the French army has marched south with Washington. So Cornwallis, with 8,000 men, is surrounded by 20,000 Americans and French.
Oh, wow.
And the day before he surrenders, the American-French armies fire 2,000 cannonballs into this little village.
That's so many cannonballs.
That's a lot. And
Yeah.
so he, but we're kind of, that's an old,
Yeah. That's another.
We're just trying to talk about Glover and that, and that's much later part in the war.
Glover doesn't march down with them.
No, Glover is not at.
He's staying up at West Point.
He is up north, and toward the end of the war, his wife died during the war. He had to go back home for that, and some of his children were sick too. I think he had like 13 kids. A couple of them were sick and died, and so Glover is going back and forth, and Glover developed some health problems. So toward the end of the war, he ends up back in, I'd say at Yorktown. I could look this up, but I think he's finally back in Marblehead by the time we get to Yorktown. But he's pretty well spent, and he doesn't live too much longer after that either.
Oh, so he doesn't. So that's why we don't. I mean, it sounds like he played a very significant role in the beginning and the beginning of the war.
Absolutely, yeah.
But so he dies shortly after the revolution. So he doesn't hold any kind of position.
After, but he's sick, and he.
Wouldn't Washington give him some kind of position? Washington doesn't become president until what, 89 or
89? Yeah.
And then so he doesn't try to give Glover a position of any kind.
I don't know if he offered Glover a position in his administration. I'm not aware of him offering Glover anything.
He'd be like Secretary of Defense at this point, I feel like.
Well, that was Knox.
Oh.
It was called Secretary of War back then, but Henry Knox, who had been a very loyal lieutenant of Washington, he was the commanded all the artillery, played a very significant role in the major battles. Knox became Secretary of War.
Yeah, I don't know anything about Knox. I just know that. I mean, I know the individual who plays him during the reenactment.
Yeah.
But he's a
Billy Myers.
Yeah. But
he was Knox was heavy too.
Oh, he's that heavy set.
He was heavy set.
So he's to form.
He was a
out
bookseller in Boston.
See,
he had a bookstore, and he learned about artillery by reading all these books on artillery.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So then John Glover goes back to Massachusetts, and you're saying he doesn't. How much longer does he live?
I have to. Why don't we Google that date of birth and death of John Glover?
The internet isn't working, but I can throw it in afterwards.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Let's see when.
We know where he's buried at Burial Hill in Marblehead because we go up there.
I've been there, yeah.
Every year in the winter, and
when did
he died on January? Like the last couple of days of January. I want to say January 30th, but I'm not sure what year.
He died on my birthday.
I think it might be the day.
1797. So he lived.
He did live for quite a while then, yeah.
Yeah, but he died on my birthday.
And January 30th, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When was he born? So how old was Glover during this?
He was the same age as Washington. He was 44 when he crossed the Delaware.
Oh, wow. So I mean, this is the types of things that I want to talk about because you hear all these different kinds of stories these days, but you don't hear about, I mean, all these individuals that were key points of the revolution. To me, I still just think it's George Washington and the American Revolution, and it's his men, and you watch the movie like The Patriot, and it's formation fighting, and you don't hear about guys like this. Like, I don't know much about Knox, I'm not sure, but Alexander Hamilton, I mean, 18 years old when he was in the Revolution, right? He individuals like him fighting throughout. I'd want to hear more about.
Brilliant guy, becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury, and basically prepares America for the Industrial Revolution. He establishes the banking system in America,
Secretary of
which
Treasury, right?
a lot of people were critical of. They didn't want a strong central bank, but he did, and because he was able to establish the banking system the way he did, the fledgling American government was able to pay down their war debt because they had a lot of bonds and they had issued continental currency and they owed pensions and things. They were able to pay down their debt and actually begin to grow the American economy. So Hamilton was a very important figure in creating the early American economy. But what's so crazy, he dies in a duel
Burr.
with Aaron Burr. Can you imagine something like that today at Weehawken, New Jersey?
Who wasn't that bad of a guy either, though, right? Burr?
He was vice president of the United States when he shot Hamilton.
So that's another thing. It's these individuals like Benedict Arnold, Aaron Burr, they go down in history by being a traitor or by killing Alexander Hamilton. But these individuals have these amazing backstories that were actually pretty good for our side.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Alexander Hamilton or somebody else, but I think
I have a book on Benedict Arnold about all the great things he did.
yeah, but he has such a bad saying to his name. Oh, you're being a Benedict Arnold.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, no, his name in perpetuity has become synonymous with being a traitor
Yeah, that sucks.
and being a slimeball, but he was a brilliant general. A bit of an egomaniac and a bit of he had other issues. He got the bottom of his foot blown off at Saratoga, charging a British.
Why did he trade? Why did he become a traitor then? What was he promised?
He was dating a girl. Last name was Shippen. She was the most beautiful. She was a daughter in a loyalist family, and she was the most beautiful woman in Philadelphia. And he became enamored with her, and she kind of persuaded him to go over to the dark side.
How old was he?
Arnold?
Yeah, when he did this.
I don't know precisely. I'd say he was, in his 30s.
So his girlfriend
Young.
persuaded him to do it? His girlfriend persuaded him to
A woman.
Yeah.
It was a woman caused all the problems.
Oh, man.
And she was gorgeous. I've been there's paintings of her, and he became totally enamored. And it's probably Peggy Shippen who persuaded Arnold to, or at least pushed him over the edge.
She was persuaded to persuade him. I don't want to just blame it on her, but she was.
Yeah, she was. Her father was a prominent loyalist in Philadelphia.
Did we attack any of the loyalists after? Did we?
Oh, big time. That's something you can. That's another interesting thing to Google. Is what happened to the loyalists? So many loyalists went up to the Canadian Maritimes, like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and things like that, and some of them went back to England. The loyalists, we didn't treat the loyalists very well after the American Revolution.
Well, I mean, they weren't just singing praise to the king, right? I guess they were giving supplies. If they were wealthy individuals, they would give supplies and help the troops out.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't think kindly of them either.
Or they wouldn't support the congressional side, the continental side. Now, Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son, William Franklin, was the royal governor of New Jersey. And he stayed a loyalist throughout the war. And finally, toward the end of the American Revolution, he did in fact flee to England, and Franklin disinherited him, disowned him in his will.
Was Franklin in the colonies when the revolution ended?
Yes.
Oh, I thought he was in France.
No. Okay. Where he spent 17 years in England, and he came back just before the American Revolution began, because that's another interesting story in the life of Franklin.
Yeah, we can go into that. That'd be interesting.
He got badly treated over there by the British, because they caught him intercepting some letters between Hutchison and the king, and so they took him into the court and they just vilified him. He snuck out in the middle of the night, got on a ship leaving in the morning, and fled back to America. But it was more complicated than that. And then he went over during the Revolution. He and Charles Dean and Adams went to France as envoys and persuaded the French to enter the war. So that would have been in 79 or so. So Franklin, he was back here by before the American Revolution ended.
I guess if France came back over, he was coming with them.
Yeah, and Thomas Jefferson, after the war, went to France as sort of the ambassador. Before we had a government. We didn't have a government until 89, really.
We didn't try to persuade Spain to come with us. Like, why didn't we try to persuade? Is it because France hated the British? We just trusted the French more. We had more of a connection with them, or why didn't we get another country to come on our side?
I don't know. We didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure we would have taken. We had a lot of help from the Dutch. The Dutch were running guns into the Caribbean, and then some of our privateers were running the guns up to the colonies. So the Dutch were, but the Dutch basically, they would do the highest bidder. Whoever was paying the most money, the Dutch would have supported back then. But the Dutch helped us not. And that's a good question. I've never heard that question asked. Why didn't we ask the Spanish to help us? And I don't know the answer to that. So
France hates British, right?
The Spanish were primarily involved in South America and the Caribbean. Yeah, they were not really. Spain had Florida, but they were not in pretty much in North America. Whereas the British during the French Indian War had kicked the French out of Canada, so kicked them out of North America altogether.
So the French just hate the British, right?
There was a tremendous amount of animosity, and a lot of it was based on religion, because the French were still a Catholic country, notwithstanding they had a Protestant population, the Calvinists, but they were primarily a Catholic country, and the British were the Church of England. They had split off from Rome.
But then the Napoleonic Wars happened right after this, don't they?
Yes.
So, okay, well, I guess we're going off topic a bit, but I guess we can wrap this up. Anything else you want to say about Glover?
No, I just say if someday, if I ever had the time, I'd write a book of the 10 people that would run through a wall for Washington. Always come out the other side, fiercely loyal and clever and resourceful, and Glover was one of them. You
did do the Unsung Heroes of the American Revolution and played Glover with Pete Hegseth.
That's correct,
right?
On Fox Nation.
And can you find that episode somewhere?
It should be on Fox Nation, unless they've taken it down.
You can't find it on YouTube or anything like that?
I'm not aware of it being there, so.
Okay, because the only time that I was able to find it, I think, is because you sent it to me.
Fox gave me a private link to it.
Yeah, it was a 30-minute episode, right? Unsung Heroes of the American Revolution.
Less than 30, but...
Pete Hegseth, he was the...
Pete Hegseth was doing a series on the unsung heroes of the American Revolution, names that aren't necessarily household names, but made major contributions to the war. And in the course of doing that, he, I guess his staff, probably his people that do his research, had discovered Glover and said, oh, you got it. And he actually called up to the Marblehead Regiment in Massachusetts, and they said, go down to Washington's Crossing and talk to Frank Lyons down there, and that's what he did.
That's awesome.
So
yeah, it's pretty neat. Who are the other 9?
I forget.
No. The other 9 guys you're saying if you could write a book of 10.
Well, John Paul Jones would be one, and Mad Anthony Wayne, Green, Knox, Hamilton, people like that. There were a few others. I have to think about it.
Well, let's talk about the others next time or another time.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I really appreciate it.
Okay. Very good.
Yeah. Thank you.